The Taifas were in danger. The Christian kingdoms were unbeatable and threatened to expel the Saracens from the peninsula. It was time to repeat the same mistake that so many others had previously made on the peninsula. Request help from abroad. Year 1077 after Christ, the Iberian Peninsula is convulsing. On one hand, the Christian kingdoms remain united and ready to continue the reconquest, while the once powerful Caliphate of Cordoba has disintegrated and divided into multiple Taifa kingdoms. It was during this time that the Criminal Investigation Department became a legend. But for him, I will surely dedicate an exclusive video or series. In this chapter, we are going to talk about the arrival of a new foreign power to the peninsula. It turns out that the Taifas paid several to the Christian kingdoms so that they would not carry out attacks against their tiny kingdoms. But of course, these pariahs are a humiliation and above all a very significant expense. So the Taifas decided to rebel. Did they have the power to face the Christians on their own? Perhaps if they all organized under the same banner, yes, but the quarrels between them were numerous, so that seemed impossible. Which left only one possibility: ask for outside help. It turns out that in Mauritania, the rulers had just been replaced by a new power, the Almoravids. I will talk in depth about them in another video here. What we need to know for now is that in this year they took Tangier and Melilla, and 7 years later Ceuta would fall. The Almoravids were led by Yusuf, an Islamic fundamentalist if there ever was one, who probably already had the conquest of Al-Andalus as his goal. Well then, in 1077, the Taifa kingdoms asked him to send troops to rebel against the Christians, but Yusuf ignored them. In 1082, the Taifa kingdoms asked for his help again, but Yusuf once again rejected the request. This was a problem for the Taifa kingdoms, who had to do something about the Christians, as their coffers were being emptied and their people wanted change. And the final blow was that in 1085, Toledo fell into the hands of Alfonso VI. They were in a dilemma. They already knew that Yusuf would not help them with troops. What he wanted was to take over the Taifa kingdoms. So there were two options. On one hand, they could ask for help from the Christians to fight against the Almoravids and thus save their small Taifa kingdoms. But of course then, the Muslim population would see their kings as traitors. On the other hand, they could call Yusuf and hand over the Taifas to him, in exchange for him defeating the Christians. In this way, Islam on the peninsula would be saved, although it would become even more radicalized and the Taifas would disappear. So these kings would lose their power. Finally, the king of Seville, Almoravid, was the one who sent a definitive call for help to Yusuf, supported by the kings of Badajoz and Granada. The three kings personally marched with the request and met with Yusuf. After a negotiation, on the 30th of June of the year, 70,000 Almoravids landed in Algeciras, and these men did not come to make peace or to negotiate. An army of that magnitude only mobilizes and lands on the peninsula for an all or nothing, for a war without quarter, with the aim of crushing the Christian kingdoms. After landing, they were immediately joined by the troops from the Taifas of Seville, Malaga, Granada, and Almeria. Now it was an incredible army, an unstoppable army that would wipe out any resistance the Christians presented. Yusuf set his troops in motion heading northwest towards Badajoz, where the king of the Taifa of Badajoz, Al-Mutahuajil, was waiting for them. There the army of the Taifa would join them, and Yusuf's troops would become even more powerful. An army of this size had not been seen on the peninsula for a long time. So the news spread like wildfire, and soon it reached the ears of Alfonso VI, king of León, who was besieging Zaragoza. The news left him surprised, but he forced himself to react quickly. He asked for help from Sancho Ramirez, king of Navarre and Aragon, who also understood the enormous threat this posed. And he gave troops to Alfonso so that he could face the infidels. The Leonese monarch called on the nobles of the kingdom to join him. On his way south, he abandoned the siege of Zaragoza and set off. He was joined by French and Italian crusaders, as well as Castilian troops that were in the vicinity of Valencia, led by Alvar Fañez. And in October of the year 1086, the Christian troops arrived northwest of Badajoz in Sagrajas, near where the Muslim army was camped. Alfonso's intention was to defeat the Almoravids so that they would leave the peninsula and thus subjugate the Taifa kingdoms again. But did he really have a chance? It seems that the Christian troops, a mix of Leonese, Castilians, Aragonese, Navarrese, French, and Italians, did not total more than 14,000 men, of which 2,000 were knights. A powerful army, yes, but the Muslims were more numerous. Yusuf had under his command around 30,000 warriors distributed in 3 divisions. The first, composed of 15,000 men, was entirely made up of Andalusians, and they were the vanguard of the army. The second division was composed of 11,000 men under the direct command of Yusuf. They were Almoravid warriors. The last division was entirely composed of warriors from present-day Senegal and made up the reserve of the Almoravid forces. 2 figures came from a source, but other groups of scholars argue that the Christian forces were around 2,500 men, and the Almoravid forces were about 7,000. Well, the number itself is not that important. What is more important is the proportion of forces between one army and the other. Returning to the question, did Alfonso have a chance of winning? Well, he would have to play a lot with the morale of the Muslims, as well as making impeccable use of his heavy cavalry, to launch charges at decisive moments and at key points. He had to act with surgical precision to win the battle. In fact, before the battle, Yusuf sent Alfonso a peace offer with 3 options. If Alfonso and of course the Kingdom of León converted to Islam, there would be no need for battle and both would sign for peace. The second option was to surrender and pay tributes to Yusuf as punishment or as war reparations. The last option was to fight, and Alfonso decided to fight. I'm going to give my personal opinion. It's true that the Christian eyes of the peninsula and perhaps part of European Christianity were on him at that moment. But a battle where you are outnumbered by more than 2 to 1 is very hard to win, unless the quality of the troops is far superior. John wouldn't have fought. He would have tried to defend the border castles and cities and harass the enemy during the campaign. In the end, the squabbles among the Muslims themselves would disintegrate the army. But Alfonso decided to fight, and on the 23rd of October of the year 1086 at dawn, both armies formed face to face. It seems that Alfonso, intending to have the advantage of surprise, had proposed to the Almoravids to fight on Saturday, but they did not trust him. And on Friday, they formed in front of the Christians. The trick had gone wrong for the Leonese monarch. The Christian army was made up of the vanguard, led by Alvar Fañez, and the reserve, led by Alfonso himself. Roughly half of the army in each division. The entire host began to advance. For his part, Yusuf sent only the Andalusians to fight, led by Al-Mutamid, while the rest of the army barely advanced. When both forces were close, Alvar Fañez ordered his warriors to charge against the enemy. The Christian vanguard, mainly made up of Castilians, struck against the Andalusian troops. And soon it was seen how the quality of the Leonese forces was superior to that of the Taifa troops. The Muslim front began to crumble almost immediately. They could not resist the push of Christianity. I say it's not that they weren't brave. In fact, the leader of the vanguard, Saracen al-Mutamid, despite being wounded 6 times during the conflict, continued to fight alongside his men. But battles are not won with bravery alone, and soon the first Andalusians began to turn around and flee. As the Muslim line became thinner, it offered less resistance to the Leonese vanguard, and therefore retreated faster. However, despite retreating and losing warriors at an increasing speed, the line did not completely break. The kings of the Taifas sent messengers to where Yusuf was, begging him to come to their aid, but Yusuf told his officers, I quote literally, "What do I care if those die? Everyone is our enemy." But he was not foolish. He knew that if the vanguard fell, chaos could spread in his army. So he sent part of the Almoravid troops under the command of Abu Bakr to reinforce the front. To avoid a disorderly retreat, Alfonso then decided to relieve his troops. He ordered Albarfáñez to have his men rest in reserve, and the monarch himself advanced with the troops under his command to continue pressing the Muslim front, now reinforced by the troops of Abu Bakr. Then Yusuf, seeing that Alfonso had put all his cards on the table, decided to deliver the coup de grace. He took the remaining Almoravid troops he had brought with him. Remember, it was the 2nd Division of the army. He divided it into 2 and ordered them to surround the battlefront. He himself led the right flank. His intention was to surround the Christian army and massacre them without mercy, to thus teach a lesson to the Christian kingdoms and show them that now he was the one who had the power. Of course, when Albarfáñez saw that enemy troops began to appear at the ends of the front, he barely had time to react. He ordered his men, who were already tired from the fight, to form a half-moon with their backs to Alfonso's troops. To prevent the Christian front from being attacked from the rear, all Christian plans had gone awry in a matter of minutes. What seemed like it was going to be a victory had turned into a trap that threatened to annihilate his entire army. It was clear that the Leonese morale was not going to hold up for long, so he ordered an orderly retreat. Fáñez on one hand and Alfonso on the other were trying to keep the army cohesive while they very slowly retreated back to the camp. They would only survive if they stayed together, if panic did not spread. Then Yusuf delivered the coup de grace. He sent the Senegalese reserves to charge against the Christian front. Let's remember that they were fresh troops and that their physical appearance would scare Alfonso's troops, who were already quite morally shaken. The attack was devastating. The Leonese front collapsed, disintegrated, so that the Almoravid troops entered the interior of the Christian defensive perimeter. Once this happens, almost 100% of the time it turns into a massacre. And this was no exception. Through the gap, Saracen troops began to slip through, attacking the Christians from behind who were trying to maintain the defensive perimeter. Alfonso himself was forced to fight hand-to-hand with the Senegalese, fighting for his own life. In fact, he received a spear thrust in the thigh that endangered his life. There was no way to save the situation. He ordered a full retreat. Every man for himself. He himself stripped his mount and had to ride almost 100 kilometers wounded until he reached Coria, where he could heal his wounds. Of the 2,000 knights, only 100 survived, while of the total army, only 7,000 men came out alive. We're talking about more than half of the Leonese host being annihilated in a single battle over the course of a single day. The Almoravids, victorious on the battlefield, cut off the heads of the dead Christians and the prisoners they had taken. They made mountains with them, and on these the muezzins called to prayer and sang the glories of Allah and His Prophet Muhammad. Although it's so macabre that it might seem false, it's actually real. The Muslim victory had been overwhelming, but fortunately for the Christians, Yusuf was unable to advance north and conquer Laonnais territory. It turns out that his heir had died, and therefore he had to return to Africa to put his domains in order before his power was questioned. In the end, the Almoravids had arrived like a wave, and like a wave they retreated. But they retreated for now, for they would return. The Christian kingdoms were now in a tricky situation after the disaster of Sagrajas. But since the Taifa kingdoms could not launch conquest campaigns by themselves, and the Almoravids were not there to help them, us at a territorial level, nothing changed, but at a political level it did. Practically all the Taifas over the next few years would be replaced by the Almoravid Empire.